Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out, and I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now, to our guest. It's one thing to listen to doom and gloom about food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation. It's quite another thing to hear practical, immediately actionable advice from experts who can help you reduce the fear, anxiety, and burden of these problems. Tune in now to the Surviving Hard Times podcast from the Finding Genius Foundation with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Surviving Hard Times podcast. I have Dr. Lenny Wells. He's a professor of horticulture and an extension pecan specialist with the University of Georgia, stationed at the UGA Tifton campus in Tifton, Georgia. So we're going to talk about his research and his work. So, Lenny, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, if you would tell me a bit, how did you get interested in pecans in particular? Why that kind of nut, and why not other vegetables or things like that?
Well, it's kind of a long story how I got into pecans. I grew up here in South Georgia, surrounded by pecans, but never really paid much attention to them other than just picking a few up off the ground to eat every now and then. My undergraduate degree is in biology, and I kind of had an idea to go into some sort of ecological work, and then kind of went from there, got a master's in biology, and had started out looking at possibly working with birds. I was actually doing a little project on eagles where I had to feed dead squirrels and rats to these eagles, and we'd weigh the food before we fed it to them, and then we'd weigh the remains afterward to get an idea of how much they were eating. And would have to go into those cages with the eagles and try to get those carcasses away from them, and they weren't real pleased about that, of course. And so in doing that, well, at the time I also had a opportunity. I was working as a teaching assistant, working on my master's, and that was okay. But then I got offered a research assistantship to just do research and kind of be paid for that while I was working on my master's. That was working with pine tip moths, which is a pest of pine trees. And from there, I went on and worked on a PhD actually in cotton entomology, working on biological control of cotton aphids. Finished that up, started some postdoctoral work on peanuts and tobacco, looking at virus called tomato spotted wilt virus that's transmitted by insects. I worked on that for a while. And then about the time my wife and I, we were married, she was from this area as well, and we just kind of decided. I'd gone on a few job interviews in Texas, Kansas, a few other places, and had some opportunities there, but we just kind of decided we wanted to stay here in South Georgia. So I ended up taking a position as a county extension agent over in Albany, Georgia, which is kind of the center of pecan production in the state and has been historically. And that's kind of where I started working on pecans, and then that led into a full-time faculty position, tenure-track faculty position. And so now I'm a professor of horticulture and working on pecans. So it's been interesting.
They're that important that you're able to focus solely on them. And again, the work is that important that they need someone like you to do this, right?
Yes, pecans are a huge crop in our state. We are the number one pecan producer country, and that has grown since the time that I started. Prior to my taking this position, the person who was in this position prior to me had been retired about 5 years. So, we had not had anyone working on pecans in this position since then. And so it allowed me to get in and start doing a lot of work from the beginning.
So, okay, what are some of the major issues surrounding pecans or pecans? I mean, first question is, why do some people call it pecans and some pecans?
That's a good question. I get that question a lot, and I've heard two really good answers to that question. First one being, when they're on the tree, they're called pecans. When they're in a bag, they're called pecans. And the other, probably the best definition I've heard of that is when they're $2 a pound or more, they are pecans. And when they're $1 a pound, they're pecans. So
that's funny. Well, what are they similar to walnuts? I mean, they kind of look a little bit similar. They don't look at all like cashews or peanuts or anything, but what family are they in? And are there other nuts that are similar to them? And let's talk about some of the basics of it.
Yeah, they are similar to walnuts. They're actually in the hickory family. So there's a species of hickory, and they have they're actually a drupe. Pecans are. So what that means is you have basically the fruit, the fleshy part on the outside, and then inside that you have the seed. And in pecan, we actually, the shuck is basically the fruit part that we would normally call fruit. And then we actually eat the seed of the pecan.
Yeah, that's interesting because some seeds are poisonous to people or inedible, much smaller. And here you have a pretty big seed, a whole pecan or pecan, But
Yeah.
Is the fruit no good, or is it just not tasty, or how come that's not consumed?
Yeah, it's just not really edible. It's full of tannins and other materials. It's very bitter and not much nutritional value from the standpoint of humans for it. But the seed, it has always been what the edible portion was.
Okay. And pecans grow in these. How big do the trees grow, and how long is their life cycle? Like once you plant one, a sapling or a seedling or something, how long until you're able to harvest pecans from it?
Right. So, let's start from the nursery. When pecans are planted in the nursery, they're planted just as the seed. So you take the pecan itself and plant that in the nursery, and then that, of course, grows into a tree. They're grown in the nursery normally for 1 year, and then they are grafted to an improved variety. And we can talk more about varieties later. There are a lot of them. But one thing to keep in mind about pecans is they don't grow true to seed. So I could take 100 nuts off of this one tree of a particular variety, and each one of those is going to come up, and they're all going to be a little different, and they're not going to necessarily be like the parent tree was, or the nuts off the parent tree. They're all going to be very different, kind of like siblings, So to get a nut, to get a pecan of the same variety, you have to graft those varieties onto the rootstock. So you take some cuttings of some branches, some wood from another tree or the tree that you want grafted to a particular variety, and you graft that onto the rootstock. That will then grow for normally another year, sometimes 2, and then the trees are dug from the nursery. And here in Georgia, most of the trees are bare root trees, meaning they're not in a pot. They just dig them straight out of the nursery, and you just got a tree with roots exposed. So you plant that into the field to create the orchard. And then from that point on, you're normally looking at you'll start to see some nuts usually the 3rd or 4th year on most varieties, but it's usually going to be the 5th or 6th year before you have enough there to harvest, and usually about year 8 to 10 before you're really into a good commercial harvest. So it's a long-term crop.
It's a long time, yeah. Huh. Is there any way to speed it up? Has anyone figured out how, or no?
At this point, no. There is some work looking at tissue culture to try to speed that up, but it's still quite a ways away from being able to take it to the field and to make it work.
Okay. So what are some of the challenges you face in the pecan production?
Well, one thing about pecans is that they are grown over such a wide geographic area with a lot of varying climatic conditions. Here in the U.S., pecans are grown along that whole southern tier of states, all the way from North Carolina to across to California. So, of course, you've got them growing, everywhere from being a really hot, humid, wet environment like we have here in Georgia in the southeastern U.S., all the way to growing in desert conditions, say in New Mexico and Arizona and West Texas. So each geographic variation or each geographic location has its own issues that it has to deal with. Of course, in the western U.S., in those arid, dry regions, like any other crop that's grown now, they're facing water problems. So, of course, drought is a big problem out there, and having the water to produce the crop. Here in the southeastern U.S., we've got plenty of water in the way of rainfall, and we have a very good aquifer system here in Georgia. So water normally is not our issue, except in the form of rainfall, having too much water. And when it rains during the summer a lot, then we start to get disease issues. Pecan scab, which is a fungus, is our main disease that we battle. As I mentioned, the more frequently it rains, the higher the disease pressure and the more potential scab you can get. And so growers have to battle that in a couple of different ways. We do have some resistant varieties that we can plant, but traditionally some of the more commercial varieties have been susceptible to pecan scab. And the only way to combat that is to spray fungicides. And depending on the variety, you may only need to spray 3-4 times. And then we have other varieties that are really scab susceptible that you have to spray as much as 15 times in a season. And of course, with the cost of production now and the sustainability issues too, we're trying to get away from having to spray that many times, and we're trying to grow more resistant varieties.
Are there companion crops that you can grow, or cover crops, or what would help the pecans grow that anyone's observed? Are they grown alone or with other stuff?
Yeah, we generally grow them alone. And we, in between the tree rows, we'll often we have usually grass sod, usually Bermuda grass, Bahia grass. And then for kind of a cool season cover crop, we use a lot of clover, mostly crimson clover, also some of the white clovers that are used as well. But those are seeded usually you will seed those sometime around September, October. And then usually here, we do that once, and the crimson clover seems to reseed itself every year. So we don't have to keep coming back and reseeding it. What we normally do is the clover, of course, grows over the cool season of the year. As you get to spring, it starts to bloom, and then it dries down. As you get into May and June, the seed matures, and then you can just mow it down, and it kind of reseeds itself. And the clover is really good for the orchards because it increases the organic matter, improves the soil, and it also gives you a little nitrogen as well. It supplements the nitrogen that you have to apply to the pecans. And there's just a lot of good positive benefits as far as soil health with the clover. It also helps to hold some beneficial insects in there as well that can then move to the trees to feed when the clover is gone.
Well, the trees stay in place though once they start producing. How long was their useful life? Like 20 years after that?
Yeah, we have pecan orchards here in Georgia that are over 100 years old that are still producing. So from the production standpoint, it's not a problem. They still will produce nuts. The biggest issue is that the trees get so large that they're difficult to manage. Trees are really tall, as you can imagine. You're looking at 80-foot tall tree. There's not really any sprayer out there that you can spray the trees and actually cover the entire tree with. And we generally use air blast sprayers to spray the materials up onto the tree up high. But even as I mentioned, the most powerful one won't send it up 80 feet. Normally, you don't get good spray coverage above 40 feet. And normally when the trees are younger, they're much more vigorous. So that makes them produce a little more consistently and the quality is a little better. Once you start to get up to a 50, 60, 70-year-old tree, you start having more alternate bearing swings where you have a really heavy crop one year and not much the next. And the quality tends to go down because there's just more stress placed upon a tree of that size to try to sustain itself and produce a crop.
So old pecans from old trees they're not prized, they're gross.
They can be good. I mean, they can be good nuts. It all goes into the management, how healthy the tree is. But
have you analyzed like the nutritional content of pecans from really old or mature trees versus younger ones? Is there a difference?
I don't know that we've ever really looked at that. I doubt there would be a lot of difference in the nutritional content. One thing we see is that stress in general on a tree will actually make it, the nuts actually will have more higher antioxidant levels in those nuts when that tree becomes stressed. So potentially, I think the older nuts, based on that, you may be more likely to have a healthier nut, possibly from a older tree that's a little more stressed.
Well, if they taste different, then nutritionally maybe they're different as well. If someone would look,
we don't see a lot of difference in taste between the age, but definitely there can be by variety, and a lot of that has to do with the oil content of the nuts. Some varieties have a lot higher oil content than others.
Well, okay, so what are the different varieties? What are they called, the common ones?
Oh, goodness. Well, in the Western U.S., you basically got historically, you've got two main varieties that predominate out there. So New Mexico, West Texas, Arizona, you're generally going to find Western Sly and Wichita would be the two main varieties. You can also find a few Pawnee planted there now. Here in the Southeast, we plant many more varieties. There's probably at least 20 different varieties that are commonly planted here in the Southeastern U.S.
Well, why? What? Just for diversity, there's less pests or flavor? What's
part of that, a lot of that is driven by trying to outpace the scab, the disease that we face here in the Southeast in the humid areas. We have a few varieties, Stewart, Sly, Desirable, that are kind of the backbone of the industry here historically. Many of those varieties are now being replaced with newer varieties. We have a pecan breeder here at the University of Georgia who has just released a new variety in the last few years that looks really good, that's got a lot of scab resistance. It's a super high quality nut and has good yields and looks good. So there's just a lot of different things that go into the selection of a variety. You have, of course, the scab susceptibility or resistance. You have the harvest date, which can become very important. You have insect resistance, the size of the nut, the quality, which we normally measure in percent kernel, the color of the nut. All of that plays into, a grower selecting a particular variety.
So has anyone profiled the nutritional content of pecans? Like what stands out? In particular, What are they known to have?
Yeah, pecans have a lot of nutritional benefits. You're looking at a pecan in generally is going to be about, the kernel itself is going to be about 60 to 75% oil. That varies depending, as I said, on variety. The oil content tends to increase in those nuts as the closer it gets to maturity during the year. And while they have a lot of oil, a lot of lipids, a lot of fat, the fat that's in pecans is actually unsaturated fat, which we consider the good fats. And these help lower cholesterol or help lower what we call bad cholesterol, which is the low density lipoproteins. And then it also, at the same time, it helps to increase the high density lipoproteins, which are the good fat. They're also high in omega-3 fatty acids, which helps to lower blood pressure, fights inflammation, it protects nervous system, a lot of different things. And that particular fatty acid is not manufactured by the human body, so you have to take it in from your diet. You get it from certain fish and also from nuts, of which pecan is certainly one. So, there have been studies that have definitely shown that pecans lower cholesterol. As a matter of fact,
a quick question. Since you said like 60-70% is oil, does anyone make pecan oil? Is there such a thing?
Yeah.
Squeezing them?
Yeah. There are people that make pecan oil. That is a growing industry, I think. And it has a higher flash point than a lot of the cooking oils. And most people I know that use it are fond of it. So yeah, it has some advantages. And I mentioned the antioxidants earlier in pecans, and pecans are actually extremely high in antioxidants. They are. I think there's been some studies that have shown that they actually have higher antioxidant capacity than all the nuts out there, and even actually have shown to be a little higher than blueberries, which are kind of well known for their antioxidant abilities. So they're great for that. They're high in protein, fiber, zinc, magnesium, copper. So a lot of health benefits to pecans.
Okay.
Actually, if you want to try this sometime, if you go to the doctor for a regular checkup, the day before you go, if you eat a handful of pecans, it generally is going to lower your cholesterol levels within that 24-hour period that you go to the doctor. So your lab results can look really good.
How much do you think it could move your levels?
I'm not sure on the numbers. I usually do that before I go, and they're always really surprised at how good the levels look.
Oh no! Really? So okay, so you have the scab issue. What are some of the advancements that people are trying to make in pecans? Again, outwitting scab, but
yeah.
Are there any different kinds of pecans, or where do you want to take it? I mean, breeding wise, are people breeding strange or new ones or different ones?
Yeah, certainly. I mentioned our pecan breeder here at University of Georgia, and of course, the main focus of his program is to develop disease-resistant varieties. And to give you an idea of how long it takes to do that, I think he started in that position 1999 or 2000, something like that, and he just released his first variety probably 5 years ago. So it takes a while. But he has 2 that have been released, and he's got some more coming along. But you got to have a good combination of traits. And here in the southeastern U.S., number one being scab resistance, but also quality and the color of the nut. And you also need something that fits, a particular harvest date. You want something that generally now kind of the trend is to try to have varieties that ripen and get ready for harvest no later than early October, because it gets them to the market faster, and you normally get a better price that way. We're also looking at some other things. I mean, most of my research is focused on cultural management practices like irrigation, fertility, cultural management. We're looking closely now at something called hedge pruning, mechanical hedge pruning, which is a practice that has been in place in the Western U.S. for a long time, probably 15 to 20 years or so. And we've just started to look at it here probably within the last 10 years in the southeastern U.S., particularly here in Georgia. And what you do with hedge pruning is if you've seen these machines that if you're along a road and you see someone pruning the trees along a power line to kind of keep the trees away from them, it's something similar to that, where we go all the way down the tree row, and we have these big machines that cut all of the growth off of the trees from a certain distance away from the trunk, all the way down the tree row. So you're looking at normally that's 6 to 7 feet away from the trunk, all the way down the tree row, that everything beyond that is cut off. And then we top the tree with that machine and bring the height down. And there's a lot of different advantages to this. One being pecans grow so large that they tend to shade each other out, normally within about 10 to 15 years of being planted in the orchard. And then that causes production issues. Of course, if they're not getting sunlight, they're not producing nuts like they need to. And when that happens, you also have quality problems that pop up. Your insect and disease pressure gets greater. If you can open those orchards up and get more sunlight and airflow, all those problems tend to correct themselves. So one thing we're doing with hedge pruning is to open the orchard up to more sunlight and more airflow. The other thing, we bring the size of that tree down so that we can keep more trees per acre, because before hedge pruning, when the trees would get to a certain size and shade each other out, the only way to correct that would be to go in and cut out, say, a quarter to half the trees and open up more sunlight. Now, if we hedge prune the trees, we can keep the same tree density in that orchard and keep those yields up and keep quality and everything up as well. And then when you bring the size of that tree down, you can also, I mentioned the issues with trying to spray some of those, 80-foot tall trees. Well, if you're bringing all the trees down to 40 feet or less, you can pretty much spray that whole tree and cover to worry about, part of the tree not getting what it needs. We also see that we tend to always get better nut size and better quality with hedge trees than non-hedge trees. And it's interesting the way that comes about. It relates back to water. When you reduce the size of a tree by hedge pruning and keep it small, that tree still has the same size root system it would have if it was a big, large tree. So it can more efficiently use the water that it picks up and move it to those nuts, and the nuts get larger and better quality. Another big thing that we see with hedge pruning is that when we hedge prune those trees, we started a project looking at this in an orchard back in 2013, and we've still got that ongoing as a long-term study. But we saw, I think it was 2017, Hurricane Irma came through. It was a tropical storm by the time it got to this orchard, which is up in middle Georgia. And we went out after the storm had passed and rated damage in that orchard. And the trees that had been hedge pruned had about 60% less damage in the form of big broken limbs and trees down compared to the non-hedge trees. So it reduces your loss to wind and storms considerably as well. So there's a lot of advantages to that. I mentioned the water, and we've documented that those hedge trees do indeed have a better water status throughout the season. So we can tell that they actually are under the same irrigation regime. They are using that water more efficiently and better able to stay out of water stress when they're hedged. And we're also seeing some indication that potentially they can use nitrogen fertilizer a little more efficiently. And so trying to look at those a little closer, we've started a study this year where we're actually we're comparing different irrigation rates on hedge trees to see if we can use less water and grow, the same size nuts and same volume of nuts and get good yields and good quality with less water. We're looking at fertilizer in the same way, where we're looking at doing what our normal rate of fertilizer would be, and then cutting that back by 40 to 60% and see if we get the same results. So we'll have the answers to those questions in a few years, but I think it has a lot of potential to help us, reduce our water use and potentially our fertilizer use.
Okay. Is there any, I guess, last question, is there any, again, big advances coming from pecans? Are they being hybridized with other nuts, or can they be, is there any interesting future for them in terms of, what consumers are going to eat? Any new varieties or tastes or anything like that that's being developed?
Not that I'm aware of. We don't have any, I don't think there's any hybridization studies being looked at or anything right now for that, but mainly just continuing to look at being able to grow them more sustainably with better resistance. And we should still see the same health benefits from those nuts as well.
Okay. Well, very good. Lenny, where can people find out more about your work and maybe taste some of your pecans? At least find out about your work. Where can they go?
Yeah, we have a couple of different places. You can look at our website, University of Georgia pecans. If you just Google Georgia pecan information, UGA, it normally comes up. And then we also have our UGA pecan blog, where we are, myself and a couple of the other researchers here, looking at different aspects of pecan production, or kind of throughout the season. We kind of keep that updated as to kind of what's going on in pecans, what we're seeing out there.
Okay. Well, very good. Lenny, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks.
Before you stop listening, ask yourself, what are 1 or 2 useful things you heard on this podcast that can help you overcome food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation? Please like and subscribe and tell your friends and family about their Surviving Hard Times podcast. We're all going to need help now and in the near future.